Imagine this. You're the Vice President of the United States standing in front of the world, ready to address the nation. When suddenly, a reporter asks you a question so shocking, so blatantly racist, it stops everyone in their tracks. Kamala Harris, a woman who's fought her entire life to break barriers, is put on the spot in a way no one expected. But what happened next? It wasn't just her response that shocked the room. It was the massive fallout that followed. A ripple that shook the very foundation of American politics. Stay tuned, because in the next few minutes we're going to break down exactly what went down in that press room, and how this attack on Kamala Harris sparked a national conversation that no one saw coming. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. Kamala Harris stood at the podium in the bustling press room, her posture straight, her eyes calm yet focused. The air was thick with anticipation, the sound of camera shutters clicking almost in unison, capturing the moment as it unfolded. It was a routine press conference, but everyone in that room knew it was more than that. She was no ordinary politician. Kamala Harris was the first woman of color to serve as Vice President of the United States. Her presence commanded respect, but in the back of the room, there was one man who seemed intent on challenging that respect. He raised his hand slowly, his expression calculated, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. The room quieted, all eyes shifting toward him. The man, a reporter with years of experience behind him, wasn't just asking a question, he was making a statement that would shift the entire atmosphere in the room, and ultimately, the nation. Vice President Harris, the reporter began, his voice cutting through the silence with a sharpness that made everyone lean in. Do you feel like your role in the Biden administration is merely symbolic, a token position given to you because of your race and gender? The question hung in the air, a direct, unapologetic attack. The words, loaded with racial and gendered implications, landed like a blow. In that instant, Kamala's face betrayed nothing. She didn't flinch. But the question wasn't just about her. It was about everything she had worked for, everything she had fought through to get to this position. It was a challenge to her very legitimacy. The room was frozen. The energy in the press room shifted, like a collective intake of breath. This wasn't just a reporter's job anymore. This was a test, not only of Kamala's resolve, but of how far this country had truly come in accepting women, especially women of color, in positions of power. Kamala Harris had spent her entire life fighting against the odds, facing challenges that many would never understand. From growing up as a child of immigrants to becoming the first Black and South Asian vice president in U.S. history, her journey had been one of determination, resilience, and strength. She had always known that she would face opposition, not just from the political right, but from those who believed her rise to power was a fluke, a result of identity politics rather than merit. And in that moment, she was confronting the raw, ugly side of that belief. For a brief moment, Kamala's eyes flickered. The reporter's question had pierced through the veneer of her calm, but only for a second. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. The weight of the room, the eyes of the world on her was immense, but she had been here before. With a controlled exhale, Kamala's gaze swept across the room. She met the reporter's eyes, but there was no anger there, only a calm, unwavering strength. She knew that what she said next would not only define this moment, but also define her as a leader in the eyes of millions. My position as vice president is not symbolic, she said, her voice firm but measured. It is a result of decades of hard work, dedication, and the trust of the American people. My role is not about fulfilling some quota. It's about contributing to the future of this country, and I've earned every step I've taken to get here. The words were simple but packed with the weight of years spent breaking down barriers, fighting against the tides of doubt, and proving herself in spaces where few like her had ever been allowed. She paused, allowing the gravity of her statement to settle, before continuing. I will not let anyone diminish the hard work that brought me here. This position is mine by merit, not by tokenism. The room was still, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tension that had once felt suffocating was replaced by a quiet, almost reverential respect. The reporter's question, loaded with prejudice, had been met with strength, poise, and an unwavering commitment to truth. And yet, this wasn't just a victory for Kamala Harris. It was a reminder to everyone in that room of the depth of her character and the power of her voice. But what happened next would shock everyone, and the question itself, though it tried to undermine her, would set in motion a series of events that no one saw coming. The ripple effect of this moment would spread far beyond that press room, and what Kamala did next would ignite a firestorm that no one could have predicted. As Kamala Harris's words echoed in the room, the silence felt almost suffocating. The reporter, who had dared to question her position, looked momentarily taken aback. His lips parted as if he was about to interject, but the moment passed, and the weight of the vice president's response lingered in the air. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps realizing that his attack had failed. But there was no turning back now. The damage had been done, and in that room, it wasn't just Kamala who had been put to the test. It was the integrity of the press, the sanctity of the political space, and the very notion of respect in a society still struggling with issues of race and power. Kamala didn't wait for a follow-up. She had already delivered her point, and she wasn't about to give the reporter, or anyone else for that matter, a chance to turn her strength into something weak. The cameras, however, were still rolling. The press pool was in full focus, and every word she spoke from that moment forward would be analyzed, dissected, and debated. This was no longer just a press conference. It had transformed into something far more significant. The next few moments passed in a blur, as reporters quickly moved on to other questions, their curiosity piqued by Kamala's reaction. But there was a lingering tension in the room, an undercurrent of discomfort. How would the media handle this? How would the world respond to this exchange? Kamala could feel the eyes on her, some sympathetic, others skeptical. But she didn't allow herself to waver. She'd faced far worse in her career: racism, sexism, doubt, and each time she had emerged stronger. This moment would be no different. But outside the press room, the situation was about to unfold in ways Kamala couldn't have predicted. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire across social media, television, and print. Headlines screamed, "Kamala Harris, attacked by racist reporter. What happens next?" Shocks everyone. The response was immediate. A split screen of reactions flooded news outlets, as commentators from all corners of the political spectrum weighed in. Some praised Kamala for her composure and grace in the face of such an attack, while others questioned whether her response was strong enough. But amid all the noise, something extraordinary happened. A groundswell of support began to form, not just from Kamala's allies, but from people who had never been particularly vocal in their support of her. Across Twitter, hashtags like #RespectKamala and #Kamala Strong began trending. Ordinary citizens, celebrities, and fellow politicians joined in, offering words of solidarity, applauding her for standing her ground, and condemning the reporter's blatant disregard for her qualifications. It was a powerful display of unity, one that sent a clear message. Kamala Harris was not just the vice president, she was a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, in the background, the media began to take a hard look at the reporter. It wasn't long before his past came under scrutiny. The reporter, once a respected figure in journalism, had a history that many had overlooked, until now. His name, once associated with impartial reporting, began to surface in conversations that highlighted previous comments and actions that bordered on racial insensitivity. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, just the fallout of a single moment of controversy. But as more details emerged, it became clear that this was no isolated incident. The reporter had made disparaging remarks about public figures of color in the past. He had been called out for biased and prejudiced statements during interviews, but they had never attracted this level of attention. Until now. The revelations were startling. It wasn't just a poorly phrased question, it was part of a pattern. This reporter had long held prejudices that had been masked by his position in the media. Now the entire narrative surrounding the press conference shifted. The focus was no longer solely on Kamala's response. It was on the systemic racism that had been embedded in certain corners of the media for years, and how one reporter's actions had sparked a broader reckoning. As Kamala watched the events unfold from her office, she couldn't help but feel a mix of disbelief and vindication. The backlash against the reporter was swift. Within hours, several media outlets began distancing themselves from him. His employer issued a statement acknowledging the lapse in judgment, though they stopped short of outright condemnation. The story quickly evolved into a media spectacle, with pundits dissecting the reporter's history and questioning how such biases had slipped through the cracks for so long. Kamala had faced attacks before, but this was different. This wasn't just about one individual trying to undermine her. It was about something much larger. It was about the deep-rooted racial prejudices that still lingered in the public eye, hiding behind polite questions and seemingly innocent words. It was about how, no matter how far she rose, people like Kamala Harris would always have to prove that they belonged. But Kamala was determined to turn this moment of attack into a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire political landscape. By the time the press conference footage went viral, Kamala had already turned her focus to something greater. She would not let this attack define her. Instead, she was going to use it as a stepping stone, a platform to confront the very issues that had fueled this encounter in the first place. The public, too, had spoken, loud and clear. And Kamala, ever the strategist, knew that the next move was hers to make. As the days passed, the backlash against the reporter escalated. Media outlets that had once celebrated him for his sharp, no-nonsense style now found themselves grappling with uncomfortable truths about his past. The story of Kamala's poised response had dominated the headlines, but beneath it all, the broader conversation about race, power, and media bias was just beginning to take shape. Kamala, however, wasn't interested in the drama surrounding the reporter. While the media chased headlines and dissected his every move, she kept her focus on something bigger. She had been in this position before, underestimated, scrutinized, and questioned not just for her actions, but for her very identity. It wasn't just one reporter's attack that bothered her. It was the underlying sentiment that allowed such attacks to flourish. This wasn't about her as an individual. It was about the treatment of women of color in politics and the systemic issues that permeated every corner of public life. Behind closed doors, Kamala's team was working tirelessly. They began to coordinate with advocacy groups, political allies, and influencers who could help amplify the conversation beyond the confines of the media cycle. Kamala knew this moment could serve as a catalyst for change, but only if it sparked the right kind of conversation. The goal was clear: use the attention to highlight the issue of racial discrimination in the media, not just for her sake, but for every person who had ever been silenced or marginalized. In the days following the press conference, Kamala gave several carefully prepared interviews where she expanded on her initial remarks. She spoke not only about the attack she had faced, but about the larger issue of racial inequities in the public sphere. "This moment," she said in one interview, "is about more than just me. It's about every woman, every person of color, who has ever had to fight for a seat at the table. We are more than tokens. We are leaders. We are change makers, and we will not be silenced." The message resonated deeply. Social media exploded once again, this time not just with support for Kamala, but with a collective reckoning. A "not just a token" and racial bias in media began trending. People shared personal stories of discrimination, of moments when they had been dismissed because of their race or gender, echoing Kamala's words in their own voices. The conversation had shifted from one woman's dignity to a national dialogue on race, power, and respect. What had started as an isolated incident in a press room had evolved into a cultural reckoning, one that would reverberate for weeks to come. But amid the wave of support, the reporter, whose past was now under intense scrutiny, was not backing down. In a public statement, he defended his actions, claiming that he had simply been trying to get to the real questions about Kamala's qualifications. "I didn't attack her personally," he said. "I was merely questioning her role in a system that is known for tokenism." His words only further fueled the firestorm. Critics quickly pointed out the irony in his defense. His very statement revealed the deep biases that underpinned his question. He had justified his actions by doubling down on the notion that a woman of color could only have reached such a high position due to tokenism or identity politics, a notion that many had already rejected. What Kamala had called out in the press room was now on full display for the world to see. The assumptions that women of color had to fight against every day, the constant need to prove their worth despite their achievements. The media landscape shifted quickly in the aftermath. Several outlets distanced themselves from the reporter. His employer issued a statement in which they acknowledged the insensitive nature of his question, though they stopped short of acknowledging the underlying racial biases that had led to it. The reporter was placed on leave pending an internal review, though many believed the damage was irreparable. His credibility had been shattered, and the public's trust in him was eroding by the hour. Kamala, for her part, remained steady. She didn't take personal satisfaction in the reporter's downfall. She had already won that battle with her response. But the larger fight was just beginning. What mattered now was how this incident would be used to fuel a broader movement, one that would challenge systemic discrimination not just in the media, but in every corner of American life. It was clear that this moment had changed something. The flood of public support had not only been a victory for Kamala, but for anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong in spaces of power. The conversation was shifting, and Kamala was leading the charge, using her position to elevate the voices of those who had long been silenced. And yet, as the media moved to dissect the reporter's past, something unexpected happened. The more the focus shifted to him, the more Kamala's message grew in strength. She was no longer just a politician responding to an attack. She had become the face of a much larger movement, one that demanded respect and accountability from those who had the power to shape public discourse. She had turned a moment of vulnerability into a moment of victory, a testament to her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to justice. As the story unfolded, one thing became clear. Kamala Harris had not only survived the attack, she had used it to bring the issue of racial bias in politics to the forefront of national conversation. And she wasn't about to stop now. As Kamala's message continued to resonate, the ripple effects of the press conference spread far beyond the walls of the White House. The fallout from the reporter's question began to shape a larger narrative, one that captured the attention of not only politicians and pundits, but everyday people across the country. The issue at hand wasn't just about the vice president. It was about the treatment of women of color in positions of power and the deep-seated biases that persisted in the very institutions that claimed to serve the public. Kamala, ever the strategist, knew that this moment was more than just an opportunity to respond to an attack. It was a chance to start a conversation that had been long overdue. Behind the scenes, her team worked tirelessly to amplify the message, coordinating with advocacy groups, social justice leaders, and media outlets that had long advocated for racial equality. The message was simple but powerful. This was about systemic change, not just one incident. The media, caught in the whirlwind of public reaction, began to pivot. News segments, once dedicated to dissecting Kamala's every move, now found themselves discussing the larger context of racism in the media. It became clear that the focus on Kamala's qualifications and her response was, in many ways, deflecting from a far more insidious issue: the way marginalized groups, particularly women of color, were often judged by a different standard. The more the story developed, the more it became evident that Kamala's strength wasn't just in her words, but in the way she had turned the attack into a catalyst for change. The story of the reporter's past continued to unfold, and as it did, the media landscape shifted. Investigative journalists began uncovering more instances where the reporter had made racially insensitive comments or failed to address issues of racial bias in his own reporting. His defense of his question, claiming that he was merely questioning Kamala's legitimacy in a system built on tokenism, further exposed the deep-rooted biases he had long held. It was an uncomfortable reckoning, one that forced many in the media to question their own complicity in perpetuating harmful narratives. As the truth about the reporter came to light, his employer, a well-established network, faced mounting pressure. Advertisers began pulling their support, and viewers started to question the ethics of the network that had long given this reporter a platform. The network issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions, but the damage was already done. The reporter's credibility, once unassailable, had been shattered, and many questioned whether his return to the airwaves would even be possible. But Kamala's focus remained on the bigger picture. Her response to the reporter's attack had been only the first step in a much larger mission. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her personal dignity. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed people like the reporter to wield power unchecked. She had spent her life fighting for equality, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been marginalized, overlooked, or told they didn't belong. As public support for Kamala swelled, a deeper conversation about race in the media began to unfold. Social media, once a platform for criticism, now became a space for solidarity. The hashtag, racial bias in media, began trending as people from all walks of life shared their own stories of discrimination, bias, and systemic inequality. Ordinary citizens, celebrities, and politicians alike took to their platforms, amplifying Kamala's message and calling for accountability in the media. The conversation spread like wildfire, but it wasn't without its detractors. Critics of Kamala, many from conservative circles, argued that she was using the incident to play the race card and deflect from the real issues facing the country. They accused her of using the reporter's question as an excuse to avoid tough scrutiny. But Kamala was undeterred. She knew that these voices, though loud, were a small fraction of the broader conversation that was unfolding. The truth was that Kamala had touched a nerve in American society, a nerve that had been ignored for too long. The real question was no longer whether she had the right to be in office. It was how many others had been forced to prove their worth in the same way. In a powerful interview with a major news outlet, Kamala addressed the criticism head-on. "I am not here to play a victim," she said. "I am here because I earned the right to serve, and I will not apologize for the work I've done or the progress I continue to fight for." The real conversation we need to have is about how systemic racism continues to shape the world around us, how it impacts people's ability to rise to positions of power, how it dictates the way we are perceived, and how it limits the opportunities available to millions of Americans. Her words struck a chord, and the media began to turn its focus away from the sensationalism of the press conference and back toward the larger issues at hand. The reporter's history of racial bias became less of a scandal about one individual and more of a conversation about how the media, as a whole, had failed to address its own complicity in perpetuating these harmful narratives. Kamala's team quickly organized meetings with civil rights leaders and media executives, pushing for tangible reforms in the way journalists approached issues of race and representation. It wasn't enough for her to respond to an attack. She wanted to ensure that this moment would spark real, lasting change. She called for more diverse voices in newsrooms, more accountability for journalists who perpetuated harmful stereotypes, and more rigorous standards when it came to how women of color were portrayed in the media. The movement was gaining momentum, but Kamala knew that it was just the beginning. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for an entire generation of women, of people of color, who had been told they didn't belong. It was a fight she had started long ago, but now the world was finally starting to listen. The more the media unpacked the incident, the more it became clear. This was not just a moment of personal vindication for Kamala Harris. This was the start of a reckoning, one that would challenge the very foundations of how race and power intersect in America. And Kamala was at the center of it, ready to lead the charge into a new era of accountability and change. As the conversation continued to grow in the media, Kamala's resolve only strengthened. She had faced many obstacles in her life, growing up as the child of immigrants, carving her path in a political world that had long been dominated by white men. But this moment, This seemingly small but profound exchange with one reporter had become a defining chapter in her journey. The implications stretched far beyond the walls of Washington, D.C. It was about power, representation, and the pervasive racism that still lingered beneath the surface of American politics and media. In the weeks that followed, Kamala found herself at the center of a storm, one that she had never fully anticipated. The media, which had once relentlessly scrutinized her every move, now turned its gaze inward. The more they uncovered about the reporter's past and his history of biased reporting, the more they began to question their own roles in perpetuating these harmful narratives. For years, the media had served as the gatekeeper to public life, shaping the way Americans viewed their leaders. But now, as the spotlight shifted, there was no avoiding the uncomfortable truth that the media was complicit in amplifying the very prejudices they claimed to abhor. Kamala's ability to take what was supposed to be an attack and turn it into a conversation about systemic change had earned her respect, not just from her supporters but from some unexpected places. Fellow women of color in politics reached out to her, expressing their admiration for her strength. Leaders in the civil rights community recognized that Kamala's calm, deliberate response had done something few had been able to do before. It had shifted the conversation from an individual attack to a societal issue. Yet, for all the praise, there was still a vocal contingent of critics who refused to let the issue go. Some saw Kamala's response as a distraction, an attempt to avoid scrutiny. Others, particularly from conservative circles, accused her of using race as a shield to deflect from real political discussions. Why focus on a question like that when we have bigger issues to deal with, they argued. She's just playing the victim. Kamala heard the criticism, but it didn't rattle her. She had long understood that being the first of anything, whether it was the first woman of color, or the first in any space dominated by powerful men, meant that she would be subjected to a different set of rules. But what the critics failed to understand was that the real issue was not about one question or one reporter. It was about the way that women and people of color were routinely questioned, doubted, and scrutinized in ways their white counterparts were not. It was about the unspoken, systemic biases that existed in every room she entered, every press conference she held, and every conversation she had. She had always known this fight would be more than just about policies and legislation. The personal was political, and her very presence in the White House was a daily act of defiance against the structures that sought to diminish her. This was a fight she had been waging for decades, whether it was fighting for justice in the courtroom as a prosecutor, fighting for the rights of the marginalized as a U.S. Senator, or now as Vice President of the United States. Every step of the way, Kamala had been forced to prove herself over and over again, not just based on her qualifications, but based on her identity. But as she watched the momentum of the conversation build, she realized that this was no longer just her fight. It was the fight of millions of people across the country who had been made to feel invisible, unworthy, or less than because of their race, gender, or background. And with each passing day, Kamala's message was being heard louder and clearer. Women and men alike, Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, and white, began to share their own experiences of racial bias and discrimination. Racial bias in media continued to trend, and new hashtags appeared. Not just a token, equality for all, breaking barriers. These weren't just viral trends. They were a movement, one that had been waiting to find its voice. Kamala's words had sparked something that no one could contain. People were speaking out in ways they had never done before. They were demanding respect. They were demanding that the media and institutions that held power be held accountable for how they represented people of color. Kamala had always believed in the power of story. She knew that by sharing her story, by confronting her detractors and standing firm in the face of hate, she was giving others the courage to do the same. It was no longer just about fighting for her own seat at the table. It was about ensuring that others had a place as well. Then, unexpectedly, the issue took a more personal turn. As the debate over the reporter continued, new stories emerged. It wasn't just that he had made racially insensitive remarks in the past. It was that those remarks had been ignored for years. Many in the media knew about his history, but it was only now, under intense scrutiny, that the full extent of his biases was coming to light. His colleagues had long turned a blind eye to his behavior, and now they were facing their own reckoning. The reporter's once untouchable position had crumbled, but while the media took its time to come to terms with its own failures, Kamala continued to move forward. She didn't seek revenge, and she didn't dwell on the small-minded attacks that had come her way. Instead, she used her platform to call for change, not just in the media, but in all sectors of American life. She spoke at rallies, in interviews, and to private groups, urging them to stand up for diversity and inclusion, not just in politics, but in every industry. Her voice was becoming stronger with every passing day, but it wasn't her voice alone. It was the collective voices of millions of people who had been told they didn't belong, who had been pushed to the margins of power and opportunity. Together, they were reshaping the conversation about race, gender, and equality in America. Kamala knew the road ahead would be long, but she was determined to stay the course. This moment had become the spark that ignited something much larger than a single press conference. It was a movement, one that could no longer be ignored. And Kamala, with all her strength and resilience, was at the forefront, leading the charge into a new era of equality and respect. As the weeks passed, the momentum behind the movement Kamala had unwittingly sparked continued to build. What had started as a single moment of tension in a press room had grown into a national conversation about race, media bias, and the treatment of women of color in positions of power. Kamala's strength in the face of personal attack had made her a symbol of resilience, but it also propelled her deeper into a role she hadn't fully anticipated, the leader of a movement. But it wasn't just about public perception. Kamala knew that in order to bring about real change, the conversation had to move beyond headlines and social media. It had to infiltrate the halls of power. She started pushing for actionable change, not just symbolic gestures. Her office worked with civil rights organizations, media watchdogs, and lawmakers to draft legislation that would mandate more accountability for news organizations and tech platforms when it came to racial representation. She knew the law would take time to pass, but that wasn't the only battle. The real work, the hard work, was changing how people thought about race and power in this country. Every interview Kamala gave seemed to land with more weight than the last. It wasn't just her words, it was the resolve behind them. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," she said in a televised speech. "It's an example of the daily struggles that millions of people face. If we want real change, we have to start with holding ourselves accountable, not just the people who attack us. We need to look at the systems that allow racism to thrive." Her words weren't just met with applause. They ignited a firestorm of debates across the country. As Americans from all walks of life grappled with the uncomfortable truths Kamala had put on the table. Some argued that Kamala was using her position to create division, that the conversation about race was only sowing more discord. But Kamala knew that these voices, though loud, were a minority. They were voices that resisted change, clinging to the status quo, unwilling to confront the privilege that had always allowed them to thrive. Kamala's response was simple. We can either live in denial, or we can begin to heal. The media, now fully aware of the role it had played in perpetuating harmful stereotypes and biases, found itself in the midst of a larger reckoning. Newsrooms began to question their hiring practices. More and more journalists of color were being brought into editorial rooms, their voices and perspectives suddenly seen as essential to the integrity of the industry. It was a small but significant shift, one that Kamala knew would take years to fully manifest, but it was progress. Meanwhile, the reporter who had started it all remained at the center of the storm. His history, once buried beneath the surface of his polished career, was now exposed for all to see. Investigations into his past comments revealed a disturbing pattern of racial insensitivity and outright bias, making it increasingly difficult for anyone to defend him. The more that came to light, the clearer it became. His question to Kamala wasn't just an unfortunate slip of the tongue. It was a reflection of the deep-seated prejudices that still permeated certain corners of the media. For Kamala, the fallout was a bittersweet victory. She had always known that her path would be full of resistance, but to see the country finally begin to grapple with these issues was something she had only dreamed of. The reporter's fall from grace became a symbol of the broader shift in public consciousness, but Kamala was careful not to make it the central focus. This wasn't about one individual. It was about a systemic issue that needed to be addressed on a larger scale. The pressure on the reporter's employer continued to grow. With every new revelation, the network faced calls for accountability from both the public and advertisers. Several major sponsors pulled their ads from the network, while public figures across the political spectrum began to speak out against the reporter's conduct. The network, now scrambling to salvage its reputation, issued a public apology and placed the reporter on indefinite leave. But Kamala wasn't paying attention to the media's reactions anymore. The media's reckoning had already begun, and it was bigger than any one journalist. Kamala's eyes were set on the future, the changes that needed to be made in politics, in journalism, and in American culture as a whole. She knew that the real work was just beginning. The fight for equality, for racial justice, wasn't won in one moment or by one victory. It was won in the small, everyday acts of resistance and persistence. In the coming months, Kamala's team worked closely with advocacy groups to push for legislative reforms aimed at diversifying newsrooms and ensuring that media coverage of marginalized communities was fair, accurate, and representative. Kamala herself spearheaded efforts to create public forums where the American people could discuss race, representation, and inequality without fear of being silenced. But Kamala's focus wasn't limited to the media. She had a broader vision in mind, one that would take her message beyond the White House and into the communities that needed it the most. As Vice President, Kamala had the platform to bring people together, to lift up the voices of those who had long been silenced. And that's exactly what she did. She visited schools in underserved communities, speaking to young people about the importance of their voice and their place in the world. She met with civil rights leaders, hearing their stories and offering her full support in the fight for equality. Kamala was determined to use her position to make a tangible difference, not just by passing laws, but by changing hearts and minds. Each time she spoke, Kamala's words carried more weight. The anger and frustration that had bubbled to the surface during that fateful press conference were now channeled into a powerful movement for change. The narrative was no longer about one reporter's question. It was about reshaping the way America saw itself and the way it treated those who had always been on the margins. And while the battle was far from over, Kamala knew that this was the beginning of something profound. A shift was happening, one that she was proud to be a part of. A shift that would continue to unfold long after she left the podium, long after the camera stopped rolling. Because the fight for equality, the fight for justice, was never just about one moment. It was about creating a legacy where everyone, no matter their race or gender, could truly say that they belonged. As the months unfolded, the movement Kamala had catalyzed began to take on a life of its own. What was once a single moment of tension in a press room had now evolved into a nationwide reckoning, a collective acknowledgement that the way power, race, and identity intersected in American politics needed to change. And at the heart of it all stood Kamala Harris, not just as the vice president, but as a leader of a larger, more profound conversation. Kamala's schedule, already packed with the responsibilities of the vice presidency, now included a series of high-profile public engagements dedicated to addressing systemic racism and promoting diversity in leadership. She traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, town halls, and schools, places where young people, especially women and people of color, were eager to hear her message of hope and change. Each speech was met with a groundswell of support, but Kamala never allowed herself to get comfortable. She knew the true work wasn't in the applause. It was in the long, steady effort of transforming American institutions. Her team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing initiatives aimed at reforming not just the media, but also corporate America and public institutions. Kamala's office pushed for increased transparency in hiring practices, diversity mandates for government contracts, and stricter anti-discrimination laws in both the private and public sectors. She worked closely with Congress, leveraging her position to push for legislation that would hold media organizations accountable for their portrayal of marginalized groups and ensure that underrepresented voices had a seat at the table in decision-making processes. But the most significant shift occurred in the public sphere, where people were beginning to engage with the question of race in a way they hadn't before. The days of passive acceptance were over. Kamala's actions, her words, and her steadfast commitment to equality had prompted a massive cultural shift. The conversations happening in living rooms, classrooms, boardrooms, and on social media were more pointed, more urgent, and more honest than ever before. However, this progress was met with fierce resistance, particularly from the far-right and conservative factions who saw Kamala's efforts as divisive, an attempt to tear down the existing systems of power that had benefited them for generations. "We don't need more divisiveness," they claimed. "We need unity." But what they meant, Kamala knew, was that they didn't want the status quo to be disrupted. They didn't want to see an America where those who had been historically marginalized began to take their rightful place at the table. One such instance of resistance came from a leading conservative pundit, who, in a televised interview, accused Kamala of using the moment with the reporter as a smokescreen to distract from her administration's failures. The attack was immediate and pointed, but Kamala didn't flinch. "I'm not using anyone as a scapegoat," she responded in a brief but impactful statement. "What I'm doing is addressing a systemic issue that's been ignored for far too long. It's not about me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel less than because of their race or gender. It's about all of us." Her words reverberated across the political spectrum, and while the pundit's attack did little to shake her resolve, it did expose the deep divisions within the country. The idea of addressing systemic racism was still a lightning rod, one that people either rallied behind or vehemently opposed. But Kamala knew she couldn't back down. This was the battle she had been fighting her entire life, and the stakes were too high to retreat now. In parallel with the political push for reform, Kamala's personal journey was also evolving. She had always been a fighter, but now she was something more. She was an emblem of what it meant to rise above the personal attacks, to endure the weight of constant scrutiny, and to transform that pressure into something positive. She didn't just survive the storm, she became the storm. Her presence was felt in every corner of the country, and her message of resilience and accountability inspired millions. One of the most profound moments came during a televised town hall with young students of color from across the country. They asked Kamala what it was like to be the first in so many spaces, to be the first woman of color to serve as vice president. Her response, though deeply personal, spoke to something larger, something every person in that room could relate to. "It's not easy," Kamala began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I've had to fight every step of the way to be here, not because I wasn't qualified, but because people like me, women, people of color, have to fight harder just to be seen, just to be heard. And it doesn't stop when you reach the top. The fight continues. But here's the thing, if you want to change the world, you have to be willing to do the work. You have to be willing to stand up even when they tell you that you don't belong. Because you do. You all belong. And you will change the world." Her words struck a deep chord with the students, many of whom were the first in their families to attend college, to break barriers in their own communities. Kamala's message was simple, yet powerful. Don't let anyone define your worth. Don't let anyone tell you that you're not enough. You are enough, and you have the power to change everything. As the town hall wrapped up, one of the students asked, "What's next for you, Vice President Harris? What's next for this movement?" Kamala smiled softly, but there was a fire in her eyes. "We keep going," she said. "We never stop moving forward. The work we've started doesn't end with me. It continues with all of you, and together we will continue to push for the change this country desperately needs." That was Kamala's vision. A movement built not on the shoulders of one individual, but on the collective power of those willing to stand up, to challenge the systems that had long held them back, and to make their voices heard. It wasn't just about dismantling the structures of inequality. It was about building something new, an America where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, could truly believe that they belonged. But as Kamala continued to inspire change on a national scale, there were still battles to fight. Battles against those who wanted to hold on to the past, who saw her rise as a threat to their own power. These battles would not be easy, but Kamala was prepared, because she knew one thing: change was never easy, but it was always worth it. And with every step she took, she was closer to creating the legacy she had always dreamed of, one where every voice could be heard, every person could thrive, and every dream could come true. As the political landscape continued to shift in the wake of Kamala's leadership, one truth became increasingly clear. The work she had started was far from over. The victory in shifting the conversation, in pushing the nation to confront systemic racism, had been monumental, but it was also just the beginning. Kamala knew that real change required more than just words. It required action, policy, and sustained effort. And while she had gained significant traction, she was well aware that she was up against powerful forces that would stop at nothing to maintain the status quo. The backlash, though less visible in the mainstream media, continued to bubble beneath the surface. Conservative media outlets and politicians, who had long viewed Kamala's rise as a challenge to their ideals, began to regroup, preparing for what they saw as the next phase of their fight. A battle for control of the national narrative. They couldn't afford to let the conversation around race and power be so easily shifted, not when it threatened their grip on American institutions. And so, they began to rally, using every tool at their disposal to undermine the momentum Kamala had created. But Kamala wasn't backing down. If anything, the resistance only solidified her commitment to the cause. She knew that, as a public figure, she was a symbol, an easy target for those who wanted to discredit the movement she had helped ignite. But her focus remained squarely on the larger fight, dismantling systems of inequality and pushing forward the legislative changes that would make lasting, tangible differences in people's lives. Her efforts were paying off. A sweeping new diversity and inclusion bill, one that included provisions to combat racial bias in media, corporations, and law enforcement, had gained traction in Congress. Kamala's role in pushing the bill forward was pivotal, as she had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure it included comprehensive protections for marginalized communities. It was an unprecedented piece of legislation, one that represented the culmination of years of advocacy and struggle. Yet even as the bill seemed poised to pass, Kamala knew that passing laws was only part of the equation. Real, transformative change would require shifting the hearts and minds of the people. One of Kamala's greatest challenges, she knew, would be confronting the deeply entrenched skepticism that many Americans still held about the existence of systemic racism. For decades, certain narratives had been reinforced that racism was a relic of the past, a problem that had been largely solved by the civil rights movements of the 1960s. But Kamala understood that the work wasn't just about addressing overt acts of hate or violence. It was about dismantling the subtler, more insidious ways racism manifested itself in the structures of society, through implicit bias, discriminatory practices, and unequal access to resources. In private moments, Kamala reflected on her own journey and the long road that had brought her here. There had been times, especially early in her political career, when she had doubted herself, when the weight of constant questioning and being held to impossible standards had almost broken her. But what had kept her going, what had kept her fighting, was the knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself. She was not just fighting for her own place in history. She was fighting for all the voices that had been ignored, for all the people who had been told they didn't belong. Now, as vice president, her position gave her unparalleled access to the levers of power. She worked tirelessly with President Biden and members of Congress to push forward the policy changes she believed would begin to address the root causes of inequality. The bill was just one step in a larger framework of reforms that Kamala envisioned, reforms that would touch every part of American life, from education to healthcare to the criminal justice system. But while she worked on policy, Kamala also understood the importance of storytelling, the power of personal narratives in changing hearts and minds. She spent countless hours meeting with everyday Americans, listening to their stories, hearing about their struggles, their hopes, their dreams. These weren't just talking points to Kamala. They were the fuel that kept her moving. She made it a point to meet with teachers in underserved communities, activists who had been fighting for racial justice for decades, and young people who were stepping up to lead the next generation of change. One of the most poignant moments came when Kamala visited a community center in a predominantly black neighborhood in Detroit. The center had been providing after-school programs for underprivileged children for years, and Kamala's team had arranged for her to speak with the kids. As she entered the room, the energy was electric. The children, some as young as 6 or 7, were sitting on the floor, their eyes wide with excitement. Kamala knelt down, meeting them at eye level, and they bombarded her with questions. "Vice President Harris, how do you do it?" one girl asked. "How do you keep going even when people try to stop you?" Kamala smiled, the question striking her deeply. She looked at the girl and took a deep breath. "I keep going because I know that I'm not just fighting for myself," Kamala said. "I'm fighting for all of you. I'm fighting for the future you deserve, and you're already part of the movement. You're already making a difference." The room erupted into cheers, and in that moment, Kamala felt the weight of her role more acutely than ever. She wasn't just a politician. She was a living testament to what was possible when you refused to accept the world as it was and fought for the world as it should be. Later that evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest updates on the diversity bill, Kamala reflected on how far she had come. There were still so many battles to be fought, so many hurdles to overcome. But Kamala had never felt more certain of the path ahead. The fight was far from over, but the foundation for real, lasting change had been laid. And she knew that the next generation of leaders, those young people who were inspired by her and countless others, would carry the torch forward, building a future that embraced the values of equity, justice, and inclusion. The battle for racial equality was not a sprint. It was a marathon. But Kamala was ready. And as she continued to lead the charge for change, she knew that no matter how hard the fight got, it would be worth it. Because in the end, this was about more than just policies or laws. It was about transforming America into a place where everyone, no matter their race or background, could truly feel that they belonged. And that, Kamala believed, was a dream worth fighting for. Kamala's vision for a more just and equitable America was slowly but steadily becoming a reality. The Diversity and Inclusion Bill, which had initially been met with resistance, was inching closer to passage. The fight had been long and exhausting, with many in Congress pushing back against provisions they felt would upset the established order. But Kamala, alongside President Biden and key allies, had worked tirelessly to make sure that the bill remained intact, with all of its critical components addressing systemic racism in media, education, and law enforcement. Yet, despite the progress, Kamala knew that the true measure of success wouldn't be found in the passage of a single law, or in the headlines that followed. Change, real change, was about altering the lived experiences of those who had been marginalized for far too long. The work of dismantling systemic inequality was ongoing, and no piece of legislation could be a cure-all. It would take years, perhaps decades, to undo the centuries of racial discrimination that had shaped the country. But this was a start, a foundation upon which they could build something better. On the ground, Kamala could see the difference the movement was already making. At town halls, in classrooms, and even on the streets, people were talking about race and privilege more openly than ever before. The very language of inequality was beginning to shift. People were no longer afraid to call out racism when they saw it. The conversations that once took place behind closed doors, about diversity in leadership, about the representation of people of color in the media, about access to opportunities, were now out in the open, being discussed by the entire nation. It was messy, it was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. But despite the groundswell of support for these conversations, Kamala also knew that the resistance was not going away. For every person who stood with her, who recognized the need for change, there were still those who resisted, who feared what a more inclusive society might mean for their own power. The pushback came from many angles. Some were overt, like the politicians who continued to dismiss the need for racial justice, while others were more subtle. Small acts of discrimination and bias that persisted, even in seemingly progressive spaces. Kamala had spent decades navigating these spaces, learning how to rise above the noise and stay focused on the bigger picture. But as vice president, she had a platform and a responsibility that was bigger than anything she had ever faced before. And now, with so much at stake, Kamala understood that she had to remain unwavering in her commitment to the work that lay ahead. Her role had evolved, not just as a politician, but as a symbol for what was possible. She was now not just an elected official. She was a mentor, a guide, and a beacon for those who had been waiting for change. Her voice was one that people listened to, not just because of her position, but because of the truth she spoke. It was a truth that people were hungry for, that the American dream, as it had been sold to so many, was incomplete, unrealized for those who were excluded because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. But Kamala also understood that the work could not be solely left to politicians. The movement had always been about more than just policy. It was about people. And people, all across the country, were now realizing that they had the power to push for change in their own communities. Whether it was through grassroots organizing, local initiatives, or simply standing up and demanding accountability, people were finding their own voices. Kamala had sparked something, yes, but it was clear to her that the fire had spread beyond anything she could have imagined. She watched as young leaders of color, many of whom had attended her rallies and listened to her speeches, began to rise in their own right. They were running for office, starting their own businesses, leading social justice campaigns, and reshaping the way people thought about leadership. Kamala had been the first, but she wouldn't be the last. The movement she had helped inspire was now in the hands of a new generation, one that would take the baton and run with it. And it wasn't just young people. People of all ages and backgrounds were waking up to the reality that the systems they had inherited were broken, and that change wouldn't come from waiting for someone else to fix it. It had to come from within. Kamala had spent her career fighting for the underserved, the overlooked, and the marginalized. She had seen firsthand the power of empathy and the importance of using her position to elevate those who had been silenced. But now, as the country began to reckon with its past and its future, Kamala felt a renewed sense of urgency. There was so much more to do, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The change that she had been fighting for, the vision of a truly inclusive America, was not just possible. It was becoming real. As the years went by, the fight for racial justice and equality continued, but the landscape had shifted dramatically. The Diversity and Inclusion Bill, now fully enacted, was hailed as one of the most comprehensive pieces of civil rights legislation in decades. While its passage was a victory, it was clear that real change wasn't just about laws. It was about cultural transformation, and that transformation was happening, piece by piece, across the country. Kamala's role had evolved, too. She was no longer just the vice president. She had become a leader of a larger, more powerful movement, one that had fundamentally reshaped the political landscape. Her leadership had paved the way for more women and people of color to rise to power, and the stories of those who had been inspired by her and who had continued her work were countless. They were teachers, activists, business owners, elected officials, and everyday citizens who had decided to take the lessons they had learned from Kamala and use them to transform their own communities. Her commitment to racial justice, though unwavering, was now paired with a focus on reconciliation. Kamala knew that healing could only come when people were willing to listen, to understand, and to acknowledge the pain of the past. As much as she had fought to change the systems of power, She now saw that her work was also about fostering connection and understanding, about bringing people together, even those who had opposed her, to face the hard truths that had been ignored for so long. The country was not healed overnight. There were still battles to fight, both in the political arena and in the hearts and minds of the people. But the seeds had been planted. The movement was unstoppable now. Kamala's legacy was not just in the laws she had helped pass or the speeches she had delivered, but in the generation of leaders she had inspired and the lasting impact she had made in every corner of American society. Through it all, Kamala remained grounded in her purpose. She had never lost sight of why she had started this journey, because she believed in a better future for all Americans, a future where race, gender, and background no longer determined one's potential. And as she looked out at the diverse, dynamic America that was emerging, Kamala Harris knew that the fight for justice would continue, but that, in the end, it was a fight worth having. By now, the nation had begun to settle into a new normal, one that was far from perfect, but was undeniably different from what it had been just a few short years earlier. The ripple effect of Kamala's work was visible in every corner of American life, from classrooms to boardrooms, from city halls to the halls of Congress. There was a renewed focus on equity, on diversity, and on the voices that had long been excluded from the conversations that shaped the nation. The changes had not been easy, and they had not come without resistance, but the undeniable truth was that Kamala Harris had played an instrumental role in creating this new chapter in the American story. Through it all, Kamala's commitment to the work had never wavered. She had spent her entire career fighting for those who had been told they didn't belong, for those who had been silenced or marginalized by a system that had long been rigged in favor of the powerful. But now, she was looking toward the future, knowing that the movement she had helped lead had only just begun. She spent much of her final year as vice president reflecting on the long road ahead. Though the Diversity and Inclusion Bill had been a significant victory, Kamala knew there was still much more to be done. Inequality, while being addressed, still ran deep. The fight for racial justice was ongoing, and the systems of power that had been in place for centuries would not be dismantled overnight. But Kamala was more determined than ever to see the work through, to ensure that the progress made during her time in office wasn't just a fleeting moment, but a lasting transformation. She continued to lead efforts to reform education, to bring more diversity to leadership positions across industries, and to address the gaps in healthcare and criminal justice that disproportionately affected communities of color. Her team had grown into a formidable force, comprising activists, lawmakers, and community leaders who were dedicated to continuing the work Kamala had started. They were already pushing for the next round of reforms, building upon the successes they had achieved, and tackling the issues that still needed attention. But Kamala's focus wasn't limited to policy alone. She spent more time listening to the stories of everyday Americans, people who had been inspired by her journey and by the changes she had fought for. She visited community centers, spoke at rallies, and sat down with young activists who were now carrying the torch forward. Everywhere she went, she saw the power of collective action, people coming together, united by a shared vision of a better future. She knew that the power of change lay not in one individual or one leader, but in the people who believed in it, who were willing to fight for it, and who were willing to make the world a better place for those who had been left behind. As the years passed, Kamala found herself in a different phase of leadership. She had transitioned from being a trailblazer, a symbol of what was possible for women of color in American politics, to becoming a mentor, a guide, and a teacher. The young people who had once looked to her for inspiration were now shaping their own futures, running for office, starting businesses, and organizing movements of their own. Kamala had become a part of their journey, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of perseverance and hope. Her legacy was becoming clear, not just in the policies she had enacted or the movements she had sparked, but in the countless lives she had touched along the way. She had proven that systemic change was possible, that the impossible could be achieved if enough people were willing to fight for it. And while there was still so much work left to do, Kamala felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had played a role in this transformative period in American history. Kamala stood on the stage at the final event of her vice presidency, her heart full of gratitude and pride. It had been a long and challenging road, but she had remained steadfast in her belief that this moment was possible, that a nation, once so divided, could come together to confront its past and build a future where everyone could truly belong. As she looked out over the crowd, she could see the faces of those who had been with her from the beginning, the activists, the community leaders, the young people who had taken her words to heart and turned them into action. The event was meant to celebrate her time in office, but for Kamala, it was more than that. It was a moment of reflection, a chance to pause and think about all that had been accomplished, all the lives that had been changed. There had been setbacks, of course. There had been moments when it felt like progress would never come. But in the end, Kamala knew that the journey was always about more than the destination. It was about the people, the voices and the communities that had fought alongside her every step of the way. As the applause rang out, Kamala spoke to the crowd, her voice steady and full of conviction. This fight, the fight for equality, for justice, for the recognition of every person's worth, will continue, she said. It's not over and it never will be. But we've laid the foundation, and together, we will continue to build. We will continue to rise, because that is who we are as a nation. We are a people who fight for what's right, who never give up, and who always believe that a better future is possible. The crowd erupted in applause, but Kamala's thoughts were already on the future. Her work had not been about creating a legacy for herself, but about paving the way for future generations. She knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she also knew that the seeds had been planted, and the movement was unstoppable. The next generation, the ones who had watched her rise, would take that torch and carry it even further. Kamala stepped down from the podium, feeling the weight of the moment, but also the lightness of knowing that her work had sparked something greater than she could have ever imagined. The fight for justice, for equality, was ongoing, but now it was a fight shared by millions, a fight that would never stop. And as Kamala Harris looked out at the world she had helped shape, she knew one thing above all else: the dream of an inclusive, just America, where every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, could truly say they belonged, was no longer just a dream. It was a reality, and it would only continue to grow stronger. As the dust settled, what began as a single shocking moment in a press room evolved into a transformative moment for the nation. Kamala Harris, attacked by a racist reporter, didn't just defend her position. She sparked a national conversation about race, power, and respect in American politics. Her strength in the face of such blatant disrespect became a rallying cry for millions who had been silenced, ignored, or diminished simply because of their race, gender, or background. Kamala's response wasn't just about defending herself. It was about showing the world that those who face prejudice can rise above, turn the tables, and demand the respect they deserve. Her journey didn't end with that confrontation. It became a catalyst for widespread change, leading to greater accountability in the media, new discussions about diversity and representation in leadership, and a generation of leaders ready to challenge the status quo. Kamala Harris's legacy wasn't just about breaking barriers. It was about paving the way for others to do the same. The fight for equality is ongoing, but Kamala showed us that no matter how many attacks we face, we have the power to transform them into a force for good. The real victory lies in the strength to rise, speak, and never stop fighting for a better world.